Thank you all for joining us. I'm Rachel Robinson, Vice President of MassMEDIC. It is a thrill to see all of you. I know we've been doing a lot of virtual programming the last few months, and Zoom fatigue is probably getting very real for most of you, but I'm really excited about the opportunity to share this information with you today. I will not take too long before turning it over to Nigel and Jeremy, but just a few quick reminders. We do want to, minimize noise pollution as much as possible as I listen to sirens outside my window. But if you have a question, then you can use the chat bot or raise your hand. We'll probably try to save all the questions till the end, but feel free to be popping them in the chat bot as you go and as they come up. Otherwise, keep yourselves on mute. And if you have any questions as we go, feel free to shoot me a private note and I'm happy to chat. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Nigel and Jeremy from Covington. Thank you both so much for being willing to share this important topic with us, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. It's very nice to meet you all virtually. I trust you're all safe and well. I'm Nigel Howard, and my co-presenter is Jeremy Hutcher. We are both technology transaction lawyers with Covington and Burling. Our home base is New York City, but I'm speaking to you today from Westchester, New York, and Jeremy is in a steamy central Florida. And talking of heat, we're going to talk to you about a very hot topic today, that's digital health collaborations. In our presentation, we will first provide you with some highlights of what's really different about digital health businesses. Then we're going to use that context, which is important to keep in mind, because it drives what many of the terms and conditions are to put in place in relation to a digital health collaboration. So we'll kick off with that context. And then we'll take you through our checklist of issues to consider for digital health collaborations or acquisitions. And then we'll give you an overview of some of the key topics in that checklist, followed by a deeper dive into a few of them to give you insights into some of our experience around digital health collaborations. We'll then conclude with some process tips for your deals and a summary of what's really key to take away from the presentation today. You can pose questions throughout the session via the chat function in Zoom, and we'll take questions and answers at the end. So let's start by having a discussion about what really makes digital health differently.
So thanks, Nigel, for that fantastic heat metaphor. That's great. So really, to understand digital health, and you can go to the next slide, Nigel. To understand digital health, it first makes sense to define what exactly we mean by that term. And we really like the definition formulated by the author Paul Saunier. And in his book, The Fourth Wave, he describes digital health as the convergence of both the digital and genomic revolutions with health, healthcare, living, and society. And as the slide illustrates, it covers a lot of intersecting fields with everything from health IT to electronic medical records to digital therapeutics and wearables, all the way down to tools to support healthcare professionals in making clinical decisions and patients in supporting their own decisions. It also covers mobile health and mobile apps, healthcare IT. It can really run the gamut of different tools and products. So, right now, digital health is its own category, but in time, we really view that these circles will just become an inherent part of life sciences and healthcare. So in the interim today, what we'll focus on is sort of what's different about digital health, what's unique, and what considerations you should consider in your deals and in structuring digital health collaborations. So there's 4 main differences with digital health businesses. And these areas, number one, is that they involve these intersecting areas of life sciences, healthcare, and IT. And these areas are converging in a rapidly increasing regulatory environment that's changing constantly, and it's changing in different ways across multiple jurisdictions, both in the US and abroad. And that complexity is daunting. And there's really no one today, there's no major player in life sciences or tech or healthcare that have all the necessary capabilities, at least not today, So because no one company can go at it alone, all of these different players in these different industries have to develop new collaborations and new capabilities in order to pursue digital health initiatives. And just speaking from personal experience, I've worked for the past 12 months on a number of software as medical device projects, and I just find it to be an intellectually stimulating area just because it raises so many novel issues, both from a commercial perspective, as it involves, healthcare experts and life sciences experts and IT software developers, all with different backgrounds, working together with, FDA, HIPAA, cybersecurity, privacy experts in order to create, viable products that, have the important goal of improving the delivery and provision of healthcare. So I just find that to be just sort of an incredibly exciting area to be working on a day-to-day basis. Second, there's this challenge of new businesses that arise. So, digital health is a relatively new business area, so it has all the typical risks associated with innovation. And collaborations between different parties might involve working with types of companies that your business hasn't dealt with before. So if you're an emerging growth company, or you might not have worked with a major tech company or a healthcare provider, and often these companies operate with very different cultures to traditional medical device or life sciences companies. And early launch and rapid iteration around products is very typical for IT businesses, but are not typical approaches in healthcare. And this clash of perspectives can create a tension in collaboration, and it often sets up interesting deal-making considerations as companies who work in traditionally different industries have to work together and marry those cultures to find success. Not to be all doom and gloom, there's also, we've seen a shift in attitudes and adjustments on both sides. So healthcare and life sciences companies are much more willing to look at real world data and iterate and change and adapt their deal processes from what they might otherwise be used to, for example, in a drug context. And software development companies are often more willing to commit to quality processes, including for software development, that they might not have done in other contexts or in other industries. And a key consideration is that because so much is changing, in our view, it's very important to secure flexibility in these collaborations, as working from shorter, simpler contracts that set out a framework rather than being more prescriptive and rigid deal frameworks are often, in our view, more successful than might be anticipated, given that there's this need to adapt to changes in technology and the broader market. For example, companies that are used to working on rigid software development arrangements with delivery requirements and acceptance criteria and refunds due for those developments if they for those deliverables if they're not successful, might find that this might not be those processes might not work for vendors and other parties in the relationship. Number 3 on this list is that digital health often involves digital direct-to-consumer offerings. So here, the relationship with the patient is critical. It's incredibly hard to gain their confidence, and it's also very easy to lose it, especially in the digital health space, where this is often a new area for people who are moving from traditional doctors and in-person healthcare to telehealth, for example. And in the software as a medical device context, this means you have to update, maintain, and support your product, and that requires an ongoing direct relationship and direct contact with the patient rather than a single sale of the device or drug to the patient. And from our perspective, from a legal view, with direct consumer offerings, we're always aware of branding and marketing questions, and are always tuned into data privacy and data use questions that arise from these arrangements. And number 4 on this list is around protecting the innovation, and it's a very different field than what is typical in other contexts, in traditional life sciences contexts. And often there's new forms of IP that's developed. So, for example, in a digital health business, algorithms, data, and insight are often the more valuable assets for the business. And you need to consider what protection the law affords for these assets, which will be different from the types of IP that's available for a drug or a traditional medical device. And as collaborations are a key feature of digital health, there will inevitably be competing interests over who owns what IP, and you have to consider, who is bringing what IP and background technology to the collaboration, and what is going to be created arising from the collaboration. And this can include, everything from traditional intellectual property rights in patents and copyrights, as well as data or insights. And there's an incredible, basically unlimited number of ways you can structure these deals. So ultimately, these ownership issues have to be worked through. And while the concept of collaborating is not new, what's really different is that there's just a bevy of different assets that are possibly created. So really the first step in a digital health deal is to make sure that we identify all the different assets that are going to be created and all the different assets that will be brought to the table, and thinking through how the rights of ownership and how the licenses to that IP and materials will be allocated between the parties. Because if you don't do this in advance, the underlying economics of the deal, which is what we'll discuss later, can vary greatly, may no longer be sensible. Turn it back to you, Nigel.
From you. So, okay, the next slide just provides a few data points on key market trends around digital health. The takeaway from this slide is that the investment market, both venture and private equity, has matured, and that year over year we continually see increases in investment dollars into the digital health space. There were 6 IPOs for digital health companies in 2019, but there remains many acute needs in healthcare. So there are plenty of opportunities for digital health companies that remain. As Jeremy has said, it's difficult to go it alone in digital health. No one company has all the pieces they would need for a digital solution. So it's worth thinking about the landscape of potential partners and collaborators in the digital health arena. And as this slide illustrates, it's very varied. A medical device company, for instance, may find itself collaborating with the kinds of companies that it doesn't normally deal with in its day-to-day business. When you overlay on top of that all of the different types of law and regulations that apply in the digital health arena, the sheer complexity of collaborations in this space starts to become apparent. And so one of the key things to start thinking about with the digital health collaboration is, how do you navigate all these different intersecting issues and all this complexity? On top of all of that, the rules keep on changing. The regulators are evolving their thinking around how to address developments in digital health. For the most part, it's largely a risk-based analysis. The FDA, for instance, will potentially regulate a digital health solution as a medical device, depending on the risk to the patient that it presents. We've definitely seen from FDA a whole slew of different guidelines and policy documents expounding and explaining their shifting approach to regulation in the digital health arena. And what's really interesting is that shift has been, from the agency, has really been a change from a traditional product and category based assessment to a developer based assessment. So I'll look at the quality and the excellence of standards exhibited by the developer of the digital health solution. So it's really important, as you're collaborating in this space, that you're on top of how the law is evolving in this area, so that you can understand what the regulatory implications will be for the new business that you're developing. And this may all sound quite daunting, and at some level it is, but in our experience, the way to address this complexity is by having a systematic, multidisciplinary, and multi-jurisdictional approach. We'll explain what we mean by all that as we go through the presentation. And the checklist that Jeremy will now take us through is one example of this, about how if you're systematic in your approach to dealing with all this complexity, then you can ensure that you don't trip up over the legal and regulatory issues, and you preserve the value in the collaboration or acquisition that you're pursuing. So Jeremy, want to move to the checklist?
Sure. Do you want to move one more slide? Thank you. So here we put together a checklist of terms that you might want to consider including in your term sheet. Now, of course, every deal is different, so a lot of this may or may not apply, but we've tried to be as expansive as possible and consider all the different areas that we would typically at least raise with the client in structuring these deals. So at the very outset, we're just talking about who are the parties. If it's a company working with a software vendor, there's considerations around, with a startup, there's considerations around a guarantee that might need to be considered. So for example, who will stand behind the startup, and they might have a well-funded company behind it. They might have been spun out of a larger company over at a previous time. And to the extent that digital health is not the main business of your company, it might be considering whether to spin out at some point, whether prior to entering into the deal or afterwards, the digital health business into a new company. So that, of course, will vary based on every deal. Second is a question of what is the scope and purpose of the transaction. And it's very important for the commercial teams to always have a sense of why we're entering into a collaboration and what's the purpose of this collaboration. Is it to, for example, generate specific categories of data? Is it to enter this field and get a sense of what's working and what's not, to get a better sense of the services that different industry players can provide? In terms of exclusivity, this is a key area. If you're working in the software as a medical device context, for example, with a software vendor, you could split up exclusivity in any number of ways. It could be done by therapeutic area. So if I'm company A and I'm engaging a software, a tech company to develop a product for me, might not want them to compete with me in a particular therapeutic area. So if I'm working on a diabetes product, I might not want that vendor being able to go out and create a diabetes product in the same region or for a certain period of time, or using a similar underlying methodology or technology that I had developed together with that vendor. It can even be broken down through granular levels like product features. So if there's a specific messaging functionality in an app and one company brought that to the other company, we might often ask for exclusivity over that feature in other products. The next area is ownership of intellectual property. So at the outset of a collaboration, as mentioned earlier, we have to decide whether or not how the ownership of the intellectual property is going to be allocated. And one way that people often are inclined to go is to have joint ownership of IP, which I think most intellectual property lawyers will try to scare you off of that pretty quickly because of the issues it raises. But sometimes it's actually the correct approach, and every deal, of course, is different. And then second is this concept of improvements, and which party is going to own improvements of underlying IP or IP that's been developed during the term or following the term. Piggybacking on that is a question of what's going to be licensed. Is it certain software? Is it algorithms, data? Who's going to own it? How long is it going to be licensed for? For what use case is the particular intellectual property or data going to be licensed in? Is it going to be as above with exclusivity in a certain indication or in a certain therapeutic area? What are the rights to sublicense that intellectual property? Another one is the term of the deal. It might seem straightforward. Often in the software as a medical device deals I've worked on, I think often clients are very quick to get started, but haven't thought through how long a deal should actually last for, or whether a vendor is being engaged just to build something or to build and support it. And that has implications on how long the contract should last for, and whether or not we actually should push forward with a long-term contract when a shorter-term contract might actually be preferable. Similarly to the license terms, is a question around data rights. Again, in the medical device context, there's a question, or the software as medical device especially, a lot of data can be generated from the use or collected from a product. And sometimes I work with clients and they say, oh, I want all of the data. And you have to be more prescriptive than that. And I think at the very outset of a collaboration, you have to think through exactly what data am I asking to be collected. Is it possible to be collected? Are there laws? Are there data privacy laws or HIPAA laws that might prevent the use or reporting of certain data? Similarly, just from a commercial perspective, we could structure a deal so that certain data generated can be exclusive to certain use cases. So maybe one party or the other can use the data generated in clinical trials, whereas the other party would be excluded from that use case or from using it in competing products. The next is the question around the third-party products and services that would have to be integrated into a product. So as in any software development, you're going to have third-party systems that need to be integrated into an interface with the underlying product. So in a digital app context, for example, cloud providers are important, and the hosting and maintenance of those providers that those providers provide is essential to making the app work. And similarly, we might work with, you might find that you have to integrate with third-party systems like user interfaces, and that requires collaboration not only between maybe a traditional pharma company working on a device and a software vendor, but also between two different software vendors, one with an expertise in user interfaces and product design, with a more of a back-end infrastructure company. And finally, there's questions around open source software and whether or not that whether OSS should be included in the development of a product, and whether or not sometimes, whether an example of working with industry and universities, whether or not the actual invention itself should be licensed on an open source basis, including to for more broad public health benefits.
Mm-hmm. We actually have a question about that too, Jeremy. So we can
oh, sure,
delve into that a little bit later in the presentation in more depth.
Sure. Service levels we'll get to in a bit more detail at the end of this. And what's interesting, I think, about these deals is really, should have bought AirPods, coming up with a structure for service levels. Because it's such a new field, there is no real right answer as to how you should calculate metrics and credits for service levels, or how you should determine termination rates. Finally, on the economic side, the commercial side, there's any number of ways you can structure a digital health collaboration. It could be a simple fee for services arrangement where you're paying on a time and materials basis. There could be upfront payments accompanied by or not accompanied by royalties or revenue shares. There's often ongoing support, maintenance, and other relevant services fees for after a product is built to consider. And then also, of course, you could invest in, these deals are often accompanied by an equity investment, as we'll get into a bit later. And I don't know if I need to go through all of these, but another one I'd like to touch on is figuring out how to deal with termination rights and planning at the beginning for the end, because I think it's ultimately very important, especially in the software as a medical device context, to consider how you can transition from one platform to another. And that's something we'll get into a bit at the end of this presentation. Go to the next slide. touch on some other areas here. A key one that we'd like to focus on is the technical due diligence that needs to be considered before entering into a transaction. And some software vendors offer purely custom development, and you can engage a developer to develop a bespoke product for you, for your company to own it. Sometimes the vendor will offer a platform and you'll be taking a license to it. So it's very important to understand the nature of the services that can be provided, as it runs the gamut across different companies. Similarly, you have to consider whether or not a vendor would be open to escrowing its source code. Often in the platform context, that might not make sense because that would have implications for the vendor's business and the rights on an ongoing basis, and it might not even be functionally useful for you to actually make use of that source code on a going forward basis. And similarly, in the device context, there's a main question around, one, whether the device will be regulated by FDA or other similar authorities in other jurisdictions or not, and if so, which of the two parties will be responsible for submitting making regulatory submissions to the FDA. There's a number of other topics here, but we don't have all day. I think in terms of the privacy questions, I think it's essential to have a privacy expert involved early on and consider how the particular device or product is going to be offered, especially if it's going to be offered through a healthcare system, as you might need to consider entering into a business associate agreement, and that is accompanied by obligations to treat the data that's generated through the product in ways that the parties might not have anticipated at the outset.
Should we move on, Jeremy?
Yes.
Okay, great. So armed with the checklist, let's now turn to looking at some deal structures. And I'm going to give you 5 examples of the types of collaboration and acquisitions we're seeing in the digital health space. And the first is where there's an equity investment as a prelude to either a collaboration or an acquisition at a later point. This particular example on the slide is a collaboration between Pear Therapeutics and Novartis. And what I thought was particularly interesting about this collaboration, which was announced in 2018, is some of the statements by the CEO of Pear at the time the deal was struck. And it was the fact that Novartis had earlier made a Series A investment into Pear Therapeutics, so a fairly early round of investment, and then was a follow-on investor in their Series B. And it was the fact that Novartis had been tracking the development of Pear for some time that really made them feel that they would be a good fit for a collaboration together, which related to schizophrenia and MS, developing a digital therapeutic for those conditions. And we've seen this kind of prelude to a further deal in the acquisition context too. So a prime example of that is the minority investment that Roche made in 2016 into Flatiron Health, and that ultimately culminated in Roche buying Flatiron sometime later. So another potential structure is a consortium. This is where companies come together and combine resources for a common goal. In the example on the screen, we have the concept of a consortium to bring to bear a machine learning technology on a particular indication. And what's interesting about a consortia in the digital health concept in particular is the fact that it can bring together lots of different data sets. And a common theme through a lot of digital health collaborations is the desire to bring together knowledge of particular disorders or clinical information, and the other data sets that might be available to others within the industry sector or indication sector. And the consortium enables various different parties kind of share those resources together and get the combined benefit of the aggregated data sources all together. Very often these consortiums will have a rule where only those who contribute data can get access to the pooled data. And obviously the data governance around this kind of pooling of data is really critical. And those tend to be some of the key topics in bringing these consortiums to life. They are difficult to establish and can take some time, but they may well be the best structure for a particular project. A third deal structure example of collaborations in digital health is just a straight research collaboration. So one or more companies coming together because they have a common purpose or common desire to research a particular area. I've used Apple as their collaboration with J&J as an early example of this. And Apple, as you may know, is a research app available on their devices. It has now established various academic and corporate collaborations around the use of the Apple Watch for various different studies. Staying with Apple as an example, the fourth structure I'd mention is the creation of a digital health platform and an ecosystem around that platform. And this may also be a prelude to a collaboration or even an acquisition, because the provider of the platform can gain useful experience in working with members of that key ecosystem and determining which technologies and partners would be the best fit for the platform, and then potentially acquiring them. This is the classic model that Apple has used around all its hardware and software products historically. Think about the App Store, a perfect example of Apple developing core technologies for its devices, and then gradually learning about other capabilities it should add to its fold through the App Store. Apple appears to have pursued a similar strategy around digital health. Apple keeps a lot of the news around its acquisitions secret. They're often private company acquisitions. But interestingly, Tim Cook made this statement in 2019 that they buy buy a company every 2 or 3 weeks, and that's broadly for Apple. But they've made a number of acquisitions in the digital health space. I've mentioned 3 here. Tuo, which was an asthma application, a sensor for breathing. Bedit was a sleep monitoring, and Glimpse was a platform for observing just a visualization of personal health. Crunchbase has some data that indicates that the number of actual transactions in digital health for Apple was much higher. I think something like 7 last year. 5 in 2019 and 7 in 2018. So this is another model that we see where companies establish a platform and then use that to kind of learn about who might be complementary to their core products and services. And then Jeremy's going to talk about the 5th structure.
Yeah, so the 5th one is just a strategic alliance. I think that was the term that the parties used in their press release. It's basically just a pure commercial relationship between 2 companies with different expertise. Astellas, the Japanese pharma company, they have experience, navigating regulatory concerns both in the U.S. and in foreign jurisdictions, and WellDoc has an existing digital health product in the U.S. and they collaborated to jointly develop and commercialize WellDoc's U.S. products in Asian markets. So that would presumably involve adapting the apps and making it broadly applicable and useful for those markets where WellDoc did not have expertise, and as well as to broaden the adoption of the WellDoc in the U.S. By using Astellas' marketing expertise. And then finally there was requirements, or I guess a collaboration to commercialize digital therapeutics in new areas across the world. And that deal structure involved upfront payments made to WellDoc with certain development and commercialization milestones, and then royalties on future product sales. So that's just a regular straight up commercial arrangement that could be entered into on the more simple structural side of the equation. Today we'll take you through in a bit more detail some of the key topics in the checklist I mentioned earlier. And the first one is around just regulatory and legal manufacturer responsibility, especially in the software as a medical device context. The second is around service level agreements, again, also in the software as a medical device context. The third is how to transition to successor providers and platforms, and what considerations are important. And finally, we'll talk a bit more about data rights. So from the outset of a software as a medical device deal, it's essential to confirm which of the two parties will be the legal manufacturer of the product. And that means, in essence, which of the parties will have the regulatory responsibility for developing the specifications in the product, designing the product, quality requirements, and compliance generally with the FDA's requirements. And among other things, I think what's interesting, at least from my sort of software development background, is that the legal manufacturer is responsible for developing the device specification documents for the medical device products, and then making sure that it's doing so in compliance with quality system regulations and its quality management system. And that's very different than, I think, the way that a lot of traditional tech companies are used to working, because there's this overlay of the regulatory concerns. And oftentimes a company who's collaborating with the legal manufacturer will still want to have substantial input into what the product's going to do. And the FDA doesn't say that this is possible, of course. It allows the collaborating party to provide product requirements. So that includes basically a high-level description of what the design and the function, what the interfaces of the device is going to look like. But it doesn't include specifications so that you can get around the FDA's requirements regarding specification developers. And what this leads to is often unique questions around source code, which tech companies are often concerned about keeping confidential. But in the regulatory context, you might have to make your source code available to the FDA and provide support and trace individual lines of code so that the FDA can be sure that the product or device you're offering is compliant with all of its requirements. And one of the key issues to consider here is just how we're going to allocate the risk between these two considerations, because ultimately taking on the role of legal manufacturer is it's a big task, and it requires a lot of time and effort, and you have to consider how to adequately compensate the party performing this role. So if for example, if you're paying for straight software development services, you have to make sure that if you're the vendor in this case, that the pricing accounts for all the additional work that is going to go into maintaining, supporting, and managing the product on a going forward basis. Next, I'll talk a little bit about service levels. So really, what are service levels in the digital health context? And in my view, I think what I try to focus on is to focus on patient outcomes and to focus on what's most important for the product to be successful. I think traditionally service level agreements are used to really measure the quality of the service, and they're a useful tool in managing vendors. But in the digital health context, I think it's important to think of them a bit differently and more creatively. So just as healthcare reimbursement has become focused on outcomes, so should service level regimes. So taking a concrete example, if you're working with a collaboration partner who's providing you with access to a database of real-world evidence for data analytics, what could your SLAs cover? So for one, of course, I think you'd want availability. So you'd want to make sure that the system that's measuring that's going to be measured is actually subject to a performance metric, because if the system is down or if the device is down, no research can be conducted, or the product can't be used. And that's a very typical metric to measure across any number of industries. Second would be technical support. Again, this is very typical that you, of course, can only enjoy the benefits of a device or a product if the device is actually working and that the vendor is supporting it and fixing any issues. But what's different about these around these sort of arrangements, especially in the digital health real world evidence example, is you might want to consider SLAs around the study. So how long does it take for the study to complete? Are you keeping to the budget? How often is data being refreshed? Is it weekly? Is it daily? Is it available through a real-time dashboard? And can I check that the data is being refreshed and I can pull it from any time, pull it down at any time? What's the quality of the data? What are the outcomes on the population using the solution versus others who aren't? So you can come up with any number of different milestones and measurements to make sure that the product that you're offering is actually is actually useful. And I think sometimes in the, for example, in the digital health app space, there's concepts of critical disruption periods where if the app is down for a certain number of time, that could have a massive impact on the sales of the product and user adoption of the product. So even a somewhat small decrease in the service levels could have a material impact on the overall business. So it's important to give these considerations a lot of thought, because if you're not setting expectations and you're not understanding, what if you don't have a sense of what the product is going to do in terms of whether it can be relied upon by customers, it's ultimately not going to be a useful tool for you to use and for your patients to use. Another key area that comes up a lot is how to transition between different providers and platforms. So in a software as a medical device space, it's critically important to understand what exactly is being developed and whether it's actually feasible to move to a successor provider, what the timing of that is going to be, so that if you have a product and you want to shift it to a new platform or a provider, that you can actually do so in a way that doesn't lead to massive costs or is actually possible. And finally, what the costs are going to actually be for when you move from one provider to another. And if you're working with, if you're a company working or collaborating with a platform provider, it might be the case that the platform, the underlying infrastructure, or the quality management system that your device is running on is not really portable. And you have to consider that when you're structuring these deals, because if you're simply need to rebuild the product on a new quality management system, it might not be feasible for you to actually move to a new provider. So even if you had the underlying rights to the source code or the underlying rights to all the technology that's going to be developed, it might not be that important, because it ultimately can't be used in a way that's useful. So one of the questions we often ask is whether the vendor can transition to providing contract manufacturing or other sort of post-term support after the collaboration ends, or whether it's necessary to start over, because this has an impact on how you structure the deal at the outset. So this is all very important to plan for at the very beginning of the product, and making sure that there's a team aligned to managing the transition and coming up with transition timelines, because without planning at the beginning, it's very difficult to manage toward the end, and you could have surprises in costs and rights that you didn't anticipate at the beginning of the project. Finally, again, this kind of might sound silly or counterintuitive, but it really is essential to know what data is going to be collected and what rights each party will have to that data. You can't just say, we want, again, all of the data that's being generated through a product. We have to actually come up with the categories of data that's going to be collected. Is it personal data? And if so, should that data be identified before it's provided from one party to another? Are there reasons that a certain company might not want personal data, or might only want the de-identified data? Again, is the data processed on behalf of a healthcare provider, a healthcare system? Because that leads to HIPAA concerns, and that will need to be thought through. And second, though I guess the last topic here is that we can restrict data usage by contract. So for example, as I mentioned earlier, data that's derived from certain product features, we might want to restrict a counterparty from using that data in competing ways. Again, this is something you can manage in your collaboration via your contract, and as long as you're thinking through these issues at the outset.
So in this next segment of our presentation, we'd like to give you some tips on optimizing your deal processes to take into account the kind of issues that we've been discussing in the first part of the presentation. So the first thing, picking up on the theme of a systematic approach, this diagram is intended to illustrate our suggestions around how you can customize your M&A deal process or collaboration deal process to take into account all the kind of topics we talked about in the checklist and in the presentation. First of all, your due diligence process should be customized to all the type of issues that we've been talking about. A generic due diligence checklist and request list is part of an M&A deal, for instance, wouldn't gather all the information you would really need to know as you consider a potential target. So we recommend customizing those kind of documents to make sure that they're really aligned with what's happening in the digital health space. The second is you need to think about each transaction more holistically in relation to the overall strategy of the client or the business, and then more broadly into what's happening in digital health as a whole. This is definitely not a transaction area where you can do things in a vacuum. It's really important to be thinking more broadly in how each particular transaction fits into a broader strategy. The third is in the negotiation stage, a realization that speed is very important, particularly with the large tech companies. If there's a lack of momentum in the deal, you very often can lose a deal. There's a certain lack of patience with deals that just go on and on in the tech community. Similarly, as Jeremy's highlighted, there's a need to be flexible and really understanding early on in a negotiation process if really a deal is possible. So it's much better to have early decision makings and what we often call a fast fail process, so that if a transaction or collaboration is unlikely to ultimately be successful, you figure that out as early as possible in the deal process. And then fourthly, integration. Even at the deal stage, it's really important to think about how this collaborator or acquisition target or how this combination will integrate with the broader business. Planning for that at the deal stage really can help accelerate that integration process after the transaction is complete. And number 5, as we've emphasized throughout the presentation, it's really important to constantly update your processes to take into account evolving changes in regulation in this space, and to be on top of all the different types of developments that are occurring, because it will inform and it will adjust your due diligence and your negotiation stances on various points. We have various free resources available on our website. That's Covington's website, cov.com. Here's an example on the slide. It's a list of top 10 questions to think about as you're going through an ideation process for a new digital health business. The website also includes an accompanying video for each of the questions to further explain how you would approach these questions and what kind of information you can gather through these questions as part of an ideation process. Again, this is all from our experience in working through those processes with clients. You'll also find our digital health blog. That's covingtondigitalhealth.com. And that has a lot of a whole library of useful posts on developments in the business and regulatory sector around digital health. So Jeremy, do you want to sum up our key takeaways for today?
Sure. So just to sum up here, digital health is a maturing market. So you should be aware that oftentimes when you're working with a vendor, the marketing statements are not always fact. So you should design your procurement process to make sure that the vendor can actually live up to the statements that they've made in the press, so that you can vet them appropriately. Second, I think, as Nigel mentioned earlier, we really do feel that all deal structures and processes should be adaptive. There is no right or wrong way to do any of these deals, and the market is constantly adapting in terms of the types of agreements we've seen and types of deal structures. But what is important is to make sure that you have the appropriate experts in all these different areas, because it involves so many different types of experts coming together in order to create a successful product. And finally, again, it's all about maintaining customer trust, maintaining patient trust, because without that, the reliance on these devices is going to be lower than might be expected, and it's going to take some time to educate patients. And finally, it's very important to take a holistic approach and look at what data is going to be generated, what IP is going to be generated, and making sure that you've accounted for all the different eventualities arising out of every collaboration.
Thanks, Jeremy. So with that, we'll open things up for the last 5 minutes for some questions. To answer one question, we will share the slides with you all after the presentation. We also received a specific question about open source development as a tool to generate algorithms, and questions around whether that's a good process to use for develop a digital health algorithm, and whether the Alice decision, patent decision, is an issue for developing open source. So I'll kick us off there, and Jeremy, feel free to add in with your thoughts. So yeah, I think open source is a fantastic way of advancing development. And if you think about machine learning and artificial intelligence that could be supported by these algorithms, very much it's the data that's used to train the algorithms that ultimately could be the real value. So if everybody has very useful base algorithms, and then they could adapt that to a particular indication because of the data they have access to, then that just sounds to me like a fantastic way of progressing science and development in an efficient manner. Open source does, of course, come with it a different philosophy from proprietary software, depending on which open source license would or licenses apply to the particular project. It could be that there's restrictions on or a very open environment in terms of how the rights would be shared with all the different participants and the public as a whole. So you may find that your contributions, and you need to understand the contributions to the open source project potentially could be shared with others. But again, if that advances science, maybe that's okay. What some companies do is a hybrid of a proprietary and an open source approach. So they'll do a certain amount of development in the open source community, but then they'll keep certain aspects of the development as part of a proprietary forked version of the code. So that's another potential way of kind of getting the maximum benefits out of open source, but still potentially maintaining a proprietary position, in addition to the point around data that I mentioned. And then finally, in terms of your reference to Alice and its impact on patent law and software protection for patents, I guess my immediate reaction is I don't see necessarily a particular problem caused by Alice for this type of development. And if anything, it should be that there's less patent rights that might restrict the use of the work coming out of the open source project. Alice does, of course, mean that there's less opportunities for you to have a proprietary position around in terms of patents around software, but I wouldn't see that as a block as such.
Yeah,
Jeremy?
Yeah, I would just add, I think that's all great. I would just add, I think, especially if you're considering licensing an algorithm on an open source basis, and there is a patent attached to that, necessarily the open source license would include a license to that patent, in that license. So I don't think it would necessarily pose an issue of those. As you said, it might not even come up as much if the software patents are less useful nowadays.
So I think that completes the questions in the chat function. We're almost up on time anyway. So maybe I'll just say thank you for attending and listening to us. We appreciated the opportunity to talk to you. I put up our digital health blog address there on the screen, so you can visit that and read more. And we'll provide the slides to Rachel, and you'll have our checklist for your future collaboration deals.
Thank you both so much, Nigel, Jeremy. That was fantastic. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Have a great day, everyone.
Bye, everyone.